So how do the pros make their sequence drums sound really interesting, really natural, really human, without it taking them hours and hours going through adjusting every single note individually? That would be super long. I'm going to give you here a quick tutorial on how to set it up really quickly, and once you learn how to do it this way, you'll never look back. So I'm in my DAW here, and I've just got this simple little 4-bar drum loop that I've set up using a Drum Machine Designer. It's just kick, snare and hi-hat, and I've very deliberately just ensured that every note that I'm using is exactly the same velocity. So they're all set to velocity 100, and as you'll hear, it sounds really stiff, really metronomic and not very natural at all. Okay, super stiff, not very pleasant at all. Now, yes, what I can do is go in and I can start to adjust each of the individual parameters of these notes one at a time. So I could go and start moving some velocities around. To start trying to make this a bit more natural, right? So let's just have a quick play with this. Okay, a bit better, but it's pretty long-winded having to go in and click on each individual note and think, right, where do I want to put the velocity with that? Do I want it a bit louder, a bit quieter? It's long-handed, okay? And yes, that works fine, but it's still not perfect, because when a drummer performs a part on a drum kit, or even to a certain extent when a drummer performs on an electronic drum kit, the samples that they use will be layered with lots of different layers of the sample so that it's expressive, so that you don't get exactly the same pitch or the same decay time on each individual hit. And that's what we need to try and replicate here, is that human performance, whether or not we're talking about an acoustic live drum kit, whether we're talking about electronic drums, we still want an element of that kind of performance and humanism and realism. So here's a really simple way to set it up. I've just duplicated that information again, so I've got it all again here. You can see I'm using the exact same MIDI. So it's all still set exactly at 100 on my velocity scale. And listen to the difference here. Let me just flick backwards and forwards. Night and day. Slightly different kick sound there, by the way, but just go with me. Absolute night and day. So let me show you how I've done that. I've very simply set it up within the sampler. Now on the kick, I'm actually using Logic's sampler, and on the snare and hi-hat, I'm using the quick sampler. I just did that so that I can show you how to set it up on both different samplers. So let's just solo out the kick. And let me show you what I've got set up here. So here is my kick in the sampler, and as you can see, I've got 3 different modulations set up. They are all using the same LFO. So here's my LFO down here, LFO 1, and I'm using that to modulate, first of all, the volume, then also the pitch, and also the hold in the envelope. And I'm modulating it by different amounts on each one. So let me turn those modulations off, and I'll show you what they sound like one at a time. So here is the volume modulation. You can see it here. Now this is a slow modulation. You can see that it's set to 510 Hertz per oscillation, which is slow. I've set it up as a sine wave so that it's a nice smooth oscillation. It's not kind of jaggedy, because if it was a triangle it would be a bit more jaggedy, square even more so. So a sine wave gives us a nice smooth oscillation. And make sure that this key trigger is off, which means that it will just continue to oscillate throughout rather than re-triggering at the start, which would mean that every sample then sounded the same. So you need to make sure your key trigger is off. That's really important. And then I've got it at this nice slow rate. And as you can see here, it's going to oscillate by this amount, 6.9% on my volume. Now, if I were to really exaggerate that so you could hear it much more, you can hear then that some of those hits are much, much louder and some of them are much, much quieter. That's because my amount of modulation is much greater. I want it to be much more subtle than that because I want it to sound human. I don't want it to sound like some random programmed thing. So I'm going to tuck that back in sort of roughly where I had it. And then I get that nice subtle modulation. Let me take that off and let me show you on the pitch. So on the pitch, again, I'm using the exact same LFO. So I'm only setting up one LFO. I set the target to the pitch. So it's targeting the pitch up here, and you can see that tiny little orange band there. And then I've set to 40 cents. Now again, if I were to wildly exaggerate that so you can hear it much more. Okay, so you can clearly hear what it's doing. I'm just going to tuck that in so it's much more subtle. Cool. And then the final one that I've got here is set up on the amp envelope here. So the amp envelope has got this hold setting, and the hold is basically how long it's going to let that sample hold for. So I've set that to a negative value so that it's going to start sort of pulling in that sample and making some of the hits a bit tighter. Again, if I were to really exaggerate it, so doing really, really beautiful things. And if I put those three things all back on together in context. So as you can hear, that's already a million times better than it was. One key thing that I forgot to mention is down here, you've got two options for how this sine wave is going to behave. You want to make sure that you've got this second option selected. And as you can see, it puts the sort of faint line straight through the center of the sine wave. That means that the actual LFO is going to oscillate above and below your sort of target value. Whereas if you go here, you see that that line has been shifted down the bottom, which means it's just going to oscillate above rather than going above, below, above, below. So make sure that you've got that option selected there. And that's it. I've then effectively done exactly the same thing on my two other tracks, but in the quick sampler. And the quick sampler is laid out slightly differently, so I thought I'd show you that as well. So my LFO is here. I'm not using LFO 2 at all, so I'm going to turn that off. So here's my LFO 1. Again, I've got my rate control here, so I've set to 1 kilohertz here. I've got my waveform, so it's a sine wave. Made sure that it's on the bipolar rather than the unipolar, so that's the above and below option. Made sure my key trigger is off. Okay, so all those settings that I had that we talked about in the sampler here, so making sure that I was using the bipolar, key trigger off, my sample rate, etc. I've kind of mirrored them all here, but I'm using a different rate for my snare because that's going to sound more interesting. Then your mod matrix, your modulation matrix is over here. So rather than it being in its own sort of designated thing in the sampler, in the quick sampler, it's a much smaller layout. Same thing though, you've got your source here. So select your LFO 1 as your source for all those things. You've got your amount, so that's the same as this bit here, your amount there, and then your target, so what it is that you're trying to target. So if I turn that off, let me solo out my snare. So off, it sounds like this. on. And you can see it's affecting the volume here because I got the volume on that LFO. It's affecting the pitch. I've got the pitch here on that LFO, and it's also affecting the hold on the amp envelope, which is down here on this one. It doesn't give you any representation that it's sort of oscillating on that hold, unfortunately, like it does on these parameters here. But if you listen carefully, you can hear that it's doing that. Exact same thing on my hi-hat. Let me solo out my hi-hat. Let me pull that one up. Again, not using LFO2, I'll turn that off. Again, bipolar, key triggers off. I've got my rate here. I've got my waveform set to sine. In my mod matrix, LFO1 is affecting pitch. It's also affecting volume. It's also affecting the amp hold. If I turn that off, on, just a whole world of difference. Now the big difference here between my hi-hats and my kick and snare is that the rate on my hi-hat is much faster. So the rate that that LFO is oscillating is going much quicker. The reason for that is because the frequency with which you strike a timekeeping cymbal like a hi-hat or a ride is much more often than when you perform a kick or a snare. So to increase that frequency, it means that you get a bit more of a natural human variation. So let's listen to all three of those things together. Let me just pull up all three of my samplers so I've got them all side by side. And I'm going to turn off all of the LFOs, and then I'm going to bring them back in so that you can just hear how much difference this is making to the natural human feel of the performance. I mean, it just makes so much difference. The great thing about doing it this way with LFOs is that you're not having to set up these variations with automation. Automation is much more CPU hungry. It's going to be much more intensive on your machine. An LFO is just set up and you leave it, and it knows that it's doing that thing all the way. So it's not thinking any more than it already was really about performing with this sampler. It's just saying in that sampler there's this LFO and it's doing this thing. It's not having to constantly go, automation, is that moving? Is that doing this? So look, this is a really great way to step up your overall level in terms of making pro level sequenced drums. I hope you found this really useful. Make sure you give me a like if you've enjoyed it. Drop any questions down in the comments. Give me a subscribe and I'll be back with you for another one soon.